This conference will now be recorded.
Great. Shall I go ahead and jump in now, Mike? Did you want to talk about the Notewell statement first?
Sure, I'll go ahead and get started with that, Gail. In summary, we're using a Notewell approach to govern this workshop, which means anyone's welcome to participate, even those that haven't signed a OpenID Foundation contribution agreement. But just note that any feedback that you provide as part of this workshop is not considered confidential, and the foundation has rights to use any feedback that's shared during the course of the workshop. And as I just mentioned, the workshop is being recorded, and the recording will be published to the OpenID Foundation website after the workshop today.
Great, thank you, Mike. I think we can probably should move on to the agenda and get started. All right, so I'll do a quick introduction on the agenda and then a few words around the status on the foundation. And I'd also like to introduce a few of our new board members and new sustaining member companies for the organization. So very exciting time for the foundation now. For the agenda, after my introductions, we're going to have a review of the financial grade API status, and Joseph Heenan will be speaking to that topic. Joseph is the head of our certification team, so he is well versed on all of the current efforts around the financial grade API right now. Then Mark Hain from Considered Consulting and the co-chair of the EKYC and IDA working group will give an update on their work. They're reaching some fantastic milestones and actually are also moving into the testing phase for that standard. Then Joseph will be back to talk to us about the latest on the certification program. And then we'll turn to Torsten Lodderstedt, who's going to talk about the GAIN, the Global Assured Identity Network, and the proof of concept that he's been co-leading and will formally kick off in the next few weeks. So an exciting time there, and I think Don Thibault will also be supporting him in that brief. They are both co-chairs of the GAIN POC. Then we'll turn to Atul Bagwale. Sorry, Atul, I'm mispronouncing your name. But he's a co-chair of the Shared Signals and Events Working Group, and he's going to be talking about some of the status there as they race towards completing their standard, the first major draft or convergence of the current standard. We'll then go to FastFed, where Tim Capelli from Microsoft and the standards team at Microsoft are going to talk about the latest on FastFed. And then I'll hand over to his colleague, Mike Jones, who will talk about the AV Connect working group and the enhanced authentication protocol. Mike will turn over to Bjorn Helm, who's our vice chair of the foundation, and it represents Verizon, talking about MODRNA and the mobile OpenID Connect profile. And Bjorn may also share a few words around how the GSMA has received our recent brief talking about the work of the foundation with other parts of the mobile network ecosystem. And last two blocks of the agenda are Christina Yasuda from Microsoft will talk about SIOP, the self-issued OpenID standard, which is part of the OpenID Connect suite of standards, and some exciting work that's happening there. And then we'll wrap up with some questions. So unless there's any questions on the agenda itself, then I will go ahead and share a couple words of introduction. So it's been a few months since we all met as a wider membership group back in May. Actually, I think it was the end of April, and just a few days before I personally had joined the foundation. So in that time, I've certainly, as an individual, learned a great deal, and it's been great to meet so many of you over the course of the last few months. And it's also a really fascinating time for the foundation and for the ecosystem as a whole. I'm really proud of the accomplishments over the last few months. We've seen many of our standards you'll hear about today kind of moving on to mature the next stage and to release new phases of their specification. Those have been successfully moved through the voting processes. But more generally, we're seeing, continue to see millions of applications and billions of users using some of our standards like OpenID Connect. We're seeing rapid adoption of FAPI for use in open banking, and progressively not just open banking, but open finance and open data. So we'll talk about several of the countries and their status of adopting FAPI for those use cases. And we're also seeing some new standards work, like what we're talking about with EKYC and IDA and shared signals, which is quite exciting, the traction that that's gaining, as you know, we're seeing a lot of transformation in the marketplace. So we at the foundation are, you know, keen to ensure we offer a balanced view on changes happening around identity. And although we may be at this stage some of the more established and older players around identity, there are a lot of new standards work underway, some efforts around blockchain and verifiable credentials. I think those of you who are interested in that topic will particularly enjoy the SIOP session that Christina will lead at the end. But there's a lot of work that we as the foundation can do to help provide that balanced view and partner with governments who are trying to make informed decisions on their policies. So although we're not a lobbying organization, the board is looking at the kind of contributions that we can make to ensure that there is a general awareness of our standards, a general awareness of what our standards can help the community achieve, and how we can work in partnership with many other organizations and standards bodies in order to help lift up the community as a whole and crack some of the frankly intractable problems that have faced the ecosystem to date. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome 3 new companies to the foundation, so Cisco, Okta, and Visa. So I'll introduce each of them in turn and ask them to say a few words. So first, from Cisco, I'm delighted to introduce Nancy Camp-Wingett, who's a Cisco Fellow. And Cisco have been members of the foundation historically and have been great contributors to the standards more widely, but their work on shared signals and events is really encouraging and is helping to move that conversation forward. So Nancy, love to hear from you.
Hi, so Nancy actually had a conflict and can't be here, so I'm her alternate. So I'm
go ahead, Adam. Please.
Trying to do my best to stand in. I'm a principal engineer at Cisco, and I'll just briefly say we believe that the OpenID Foundation is working on some of the most important problems in internet security today, and these are really problems that can only be solved through a cooperative effort and through open standards. Of course, many of you have already seen we're particularly interested in contributing to the shared signals and events efforts. But even beyond that, I'd just say we're delighted to be here and be part of this.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for jumping in and speaking for Nancy. I thought that the blog post that Nancy wrote, that was published by Cisco in the last week, really did a beautiful job of explaining what Cisco sees as the strategic value of some of the foundation standards, particularly shared signals and events. And it's great to have the thought leadership of such a company that's played such a vital role in building the internet itself to help contribute to this next generation of standards work and collaborating together. So thank you for joining us, and thanks for speaking. So second, over to Okta and to Vittoria Bertocci, who many of you know as principal architect for Auth0, and now the combined entity of Okta and Auth0. I'm still getting used to saying that, Vittorio. So wonderful to welcome you to the board and bringing your thought leadership to what we as the foundation can do. So please, over to you.
Thank you, Gail, and buongiorno, everybody. Both Auth0 and Okta have been contributors at the technical level for many years to the OpenID Foundation mission. And now that we are combined in a single entity, we just thought it was time to step up our participation and to go beyond the blue collar discussing parameters and envelopes, but actually also talking about strategy, about what we see in the marketplace, what we believe the future will bring. And we basically have an interest in everything that the foundation does, and we believe OpenID Connect to be absolutely strategic for anything on the identity of the internet for the next years. So we are really glad for this opportunity to contribute, and we look forward to do so.
Great. Thank you so much, Vittorio. It's really a pleasure to be working with you, and appreciate you hitting the ground running, getting involved in our strategic task force in the last couple of months on the board as well. So thank you so much to Vittorio and to Okta and Auth0. Great to have you at the board level now. And last but not least, happy to introduce Visa joining the board, and David Henstock, who's the head of identity products. So David, also wonderful to be getting to know you and welcoming you to the board. And obviously Visa has been involved in the identity landscape for some time, not just from the payments perspective, but working on identity. And great to see how Visa takes these opportunities forward and contributes to our standards work. So David.
Thank you, Gail, and I really appreciate the warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to join the foundation and the board. And from Visa's perspective, as you say, Gail, we've been kind of increasingly involved in identity as just a protecting our existing business. Fraud's moving upstream, where where we need better solutions around identity verification. As well as our business is evolving to kind of more data sharing and other opportunities there. And I think the OpenID is a key strategic, both at the technical level and at the kind of the strategic level of a way to kind of influence and drive consistency, adoption, and thought leadership through our ecosystem. So we're really thrilled to be part of it, and look forward to contributing going forward.
Great. Indeed, a warm welcome to you as well, and certainly recognition between all three of these well-known names, joining our community at the board level, recognition of the importance of this moment and this time in collaborating together and taking advantage of, frankly, unique forums like this for us to come together as a community and try and crack both the strategic and the technical standards-based issues. So thank you to all those companies, and to Nancy and Vittorio and David for personally taking an interest and bringing your voice to help us craft our efforts going forward. So thank you all. Mike, moving on to the next page. I'm now happy is FAPI going to be the first block, Mike?
It is.
It is. Sorry. I think we changed the agenda, so good. Then happy to introduce Joseph Heenan, who will be speaking to the financial grade API and the current work both on the standards development as well as some of the adoption that we're seeing across different markets. So Joseph.
Thanks, Gail. So yeah, I'm Joseph Heenan. As mentioned, I'm the lead of the certification team. Also a pretty active member of the financial grade API working group, obviously, and also have various other hats that I wear as well. So today I'm just going to do a quick intro on FAPI for anyone that hasn't heard of it before, and then a bit more detail on exactly what's happened in the last year or so with FAPI. The first thing to mention is the name of FAPI. It was originally FAPI, the financial API standard. Eventually, we realised that it was a general purpose, high security API standard that was suitable for many use cases. And hence we did a bit of a shuffle to add grade into the name, whilst keeping the FAPI acronym that was already well known at that point. So the aim of FAPI is very much to build on top of OAuth and OpenID Connect and provide a much higher security thing suitable for the higher risk use cases like banking, healthcare, and so on. So next slide, please. So the working group's been going since 2016. And as I say, the purpose of the working group is very much to create a higher security model really make it easier for people to create well-secured websites and authorization servers and relying parties. And we do have an attacker model, and the security properties have been formally verified against that attacker model. So I think that makes FAPI pretty much unique in this space. I don't think any of the other what you might call competing, but it's not really the right word, standards have that formal verification in place. So next slide, please. So the main two standards we have are the financial grade API version 1.0, part 1, baseline security profile, and part 2, advanced security profile. These were previously known as the read-only and read-write profiles, but again, as we saw how they were used, it turned out that lots of read-only cases also require high security, so we renamed it from read-write to advanced security profile. The standards try to be just very point-by-point specifications that you can essentially use as a checklist. And there's a set of certification tests that should make sure the software is secure and interoperable, which I'm going to talk about in much more detail later on. So next slide, please. So we also have the client-initiated back-channel authentication profile, or CIBA, which allows decoupled authorization flows. So that's the kind of model where perhaps you might phone into a call center, they would initiate an authorization, you might get a pop-up on your phone, you would approve it, and then the call center would be able to perform whatever operation you'd ask them to, like perhaps initiating a payment on your behalf. We then have the JWT secured authorization response mode for OAuth 2.0, otherwise known as JARM. So in the context of FAPI, this is used as an alternative to OpenID Connect, so that you get a signed response back from the authorization endpoint. So it's just an alternative if you don't need the identity information about the user. So next slide, please. So the next standard we have is FAPI version 2.0. So FAPI 1.0, we spent about 4 years working on in total in the working group. It's been well accepted, it's been rolled out everywhere, but we have learned an awful lot during that process. And FAPI 2.0 aims to take all that learnings and try and produce something that's as secure as FAPI 1, but is actually slightly easier to implement on both sides and slightly simpler, and has some better security properties. And one difference with FAPI 2 is that we actually started right up front with a attacker model, and that was used to drive the standard, and that will mean when the formal analysis comes to be done, which will hopefully be next year, it's going to be much easier. So next slide, please.
So if you could just say a few words, Joseph, on how the foundation is thinking of FAPI 1 versus FAPI 2 at the moment. FAPI 1 is generally what's being recommended for those markets that are actively implementing now and imminently planning to implement. Is that right?
Yes and no. It's quite a nuanced question, and the foundation is about to write a more detailed piece to provide advice on that topic. When we look at the timelines, which I've got a bit of a slide about later on, you'll see that FAPI 1.0 went to final this year. So a final specification within the OpenID Foundation is one that's essentially stable. We don't expect any further changes to it unless some kind of nasty attack was found or we spotted some kind of interoperability problem. So FAPI 1.0 is a very stable standard. It's got a certification suite to go with it. It's been implemented by, I think, 20 plus vendors, possibly more than that. So whoever you buy software from, there's a good chance that their product supports FAPI already, or that they're at least thinking about it. FAPI 2.0 is just what the Foundation call Implementers Draft 1, which means it's a spec that's free of IPR limitations, at least from the Foundation members, but it's not yet a stable spec. There are highly likely to be changes to it before it actually moves to final and becomes that stable specification that you'd really want to base a big ecosystem on. Having said that, there were ecosystems like the UK that rolled out using Implementers Draft 1 or 2 of FAPI originally, and are currently on Implementers Draft 2. And I mean, the Implementers Draft itself is a stable standard. We don't change an Implementers Draft once it's been issued. We just issue a new separate version. So that's kind of where we are. So with FAPI 2.0, we don't yet have a certification program. There is some vendor support for FAPI 2.0, but it's not just a nice tick box enable FAPI 2.0 mode. You'll have to do a little bit more work than that to get it to work. So yeah, as to which you would pick if you were starting a new ecosystem today, that's a much more tricky point to answer. It really depends on the overall goals for the ecosystem. There would be absolutely nothing wrong with picking FAPI 1. There would be absolutely nothing wrong with picking FAPI 2, but it just depends on, how long is before the ecosystem rolls out. What level of stability do you want in the standards? Is simplicity perhaps more important than stability? And yeah, probably shouldn't talk for too long about that.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot, Gail.
Yeah, fun. Well read.
So I think I finished on this slide. So yeah, next one. So advanced FAPI 2.0 advanced security profile. So this versus the baseline profile, the advanced profile of FAPI version 2 aims to add message integrity everywhere. The baseline standard has some message integrity, but we have a vision for getting it to an absolute full gold standard message and integrity, and that's a standard that the working group is working on at the moment and has not yet gone to the first implementers draft. So that's not something you could actually start implementing today. We also have the grant management spec, which is trying to address the various slightly unusual ecosystem-specific ways that the UK and Australia invented for dealing with how do you actually change the properties of a grant the user has made and track it once it's been made. So that's just gone to Implementers Draft 1, and I think we have 1 or 2 vendor implementations of that. So that's going to be great because it's going to standardize things so that they're done the same way across the globe, hopefully, instead of having this done in an ecosystem specific way. And the simple HTTP message integrity protocol, which again is just trying to make some recommendations on how to secure messages to and from the resource endpoints, something beyond just TLS, actually looking at message signatures that would have the kind of non-repudiation properties that you sometimes want, and not purely relying on TLS as a mechanism for message integrity, because whilst TLS is very good, there's quite often bits of the system that sit behind the TLS gateway and are still to some extent vulnerable. Again, this is all we're taking learnings from people that are using FAPI, the problems they're running into, the bits they're having to invent, and we're trying to create international standards that cover those things. So, next slide, please. So the FAPI standards are all built on top of IETF drafts, and some of the work that's come out of the working group has also gone on to be IETF standards. So the best example there is the pushed authorization requests, which in FAPI were originally called, I think, the push request object. And that standard was pulled out and taken up to the IETF and is now an RFC. So next slide, please. So this is just a quote that I'm not sure where it came from, but yeah, specs are very nice, but for real interoperability, you really do have to actually test your implementations. And in fact, for real security, you do have to test. So we have a full test suite. I'm going to talk more about it later, but it's very good. So next slide, please. So this is what we're looking at worldwide in terms of where FAPI is. You can see it's the grey places are where it's not. The other places are some way towards adopting it, and the orange places are really making recommendations. So you can see we've got the US and Canada at the left, Brazil down there, Australia and New Zealand over on the side, and Russia are looking at things now. Obviously the UK as the trailblazer have been live for, I think it's 3 years now. Next slide, please. So again, this is where we are in the UK. The banks in general are required to be FAPI conformant. The largest 9, the regulator is actually required to certify and to recertify annually. Australia has a live ecosystem, just read only at the moment, but I believe they've got ambitions to start looking at payments. Brazil, which only started to adopt FAPI essentially at the start of this year, has gone from 0 to 100 miles an hour in no time at all. They're live now with both data and payment systems in timescales that we haven't seen before. We've got over 100 certified banks since we launched the Brazil version of the certification test in July, so less than 6 months. The regulator's gone all out there, requiring FAPI conformance and certifications for banks and relying parties. The relying parties are just starting to come online with the certifications, but the regulator's taking an absolutely hard line. Is you will not get access to the payments APIs in Brazil unless you have your OpenID Foundation certified mark. USA, we've just had the FDX adopt FAPI as their security profile, which has been in the works for a long time, but was formally announced last month, and then there's other discussions ongoing. So next slide, please.
Before we move on, just real quick, it might be worth mentioning Canada is basically moving alongside the US to some degree. The regulators in Canada are pushing to ensure open banking comes about, and in the last election, both parties were actually advocating for open banking. So they weren't disagreeing, they were both saying as part of their platform they should be moving towards open banking. And FDX, aspires to offer their service in Canada as well as the US, so they're actively engaged there. So we probably could have Canada shown next to the US as when FDX recommended it for the US, they're effectively recommending it for Canada as well. So that's probably one of the other major markets that's not currently shown on the page.
Great, thanks, Gail. So I've got a slide here just talking about bank and relying party behaviors. We'll share the deck afterwards so you can read the full text, but suffice to say, if you don't pick a good standard and you don't require people to actually test and certify to the standard, you are going to have a bad time. And we have experiences now of people doing either way and have seen the fallout. So yeah, certification is good. I'm sure you would expect me to say that anyway. Next slide, please. So just a few key learnings. Yeah, open banking is still new. I don't think I'd heard the term until in the real mainstream until about 3 years ago. It's now everywhere. The FAPI security profiles are there. They're stable, they're well supported, they're well used. The certification suite works really well, and we've seen time and time again that ecosystems have managed to adopt them to work. Yeah, and it's just whenever you deploy an ecosystem like this, you have to look at the incentives for the participants, and you have to align your incentives so that they deploy high quality implementations. Otherwise, the whole ecosystem experiences a lot of pain, and it may actually fail overall. And our experience so far is that certification really helps get those security risks and the interoperability problems worked out, as long as it's made mandatory from the start. So next slide, please. So just a quick review of what's happened in 2021 for the FAPI working group. So in January, our own Torsten Lodderstedt talked on Vittorio's Identity Unlocked podcast, giving a great explanation of FAPI. So I highly recommend giving a listen to that. In March, that's when the specifications for FAPI version 1 went to final. We've then had joint workshops with Brazil. We've published Portuguese translations of a FAPI explained document that was written by Taka at Orfleet, and that was translated by Danilo at Finesis Tech into Portuguese, which is obviously great when we've got a big effort going on in Brazil and 100 banks needing to get up to speed on FAPI in a very short time. In June, we launched the certification program for FAPI 1.0 Advanced Final. So prior to that, we only had Implementers Draft 2, and we still have Implementers Draft 2 tests as well for people that are still using those ecosystems. We don't leave ecosystems out to dry, and they can adopt newer versions of specs in their own timeline, but we now have tests for Final, which is what Brazil used. We did some workshops with Australia, with the data standards body over there, which is in charge of the consumer data rights specifications. In July, the FAPI 2 baseline spec and attacker model both got approved as Implementers Draft 1. And in September, FAPI grant management achieved that same goal. And in November, we had FDX formally announcing adoption of FAPI 1 as their security profile. So it's been a busy year. Next slide, please. And yeah, that was my final slide.
So if I can add in one other point, Joseph, I think it's great that we're seeing the relying party certification tests, coming into effect, and those being mandated in the Brazilian market. I think one of the recommendations of the FAPI working group is not only to certify, but also to have the certifications both on the OP side as well as the relying party and TPP side. So we're really seeing that traction in the Brazilian market, which is really encouraging, and in a way is taking them as the third market. And they have some insights which are now becoming relevant to markets that launched before, like UK and Australia, and some insights I think from across all three that are valuable to other markets as they launch. So some really great work and kind of global best practices being shared in real time.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, I think one of the things that the foundation and the FAPI working group want to look at next year is making it much easier for relying parties to adopt FAPI by helping get some of the open source implementations that might not have made it as easy as they could have for people to pick up and use with FAPI, to try and get them up to a much easier to use level.
I think it's also good to emphasize that when these markets choose the OpenID Foundation FAPI standard, it creates the possibility for longer term global interoperability, right? It is not a turnkey that it's, would come tomorrow, or there's pressing use cases, right? The focus in each market tends to be quite domestic first. But in choosing a global standard, these markets are making it possible to converge towards, global interoperability in the future, right?
Yes, definitely. And I mean, by picking the global standards, they're actually making life easier for themselves because they can just pick up vendor products off the shelf that will work.
Right.
We have seen examples of ecosystems trying to push in very bespoke directions, and unless you're bringing the vendors along on that journey, you're just setting up your participants for a more difficult time than is necessary, and you're potentially, because FAPI has the formal security analysis, you're potentially leaving yourself open to unknown attacks, because it's very rare that any of these bespoke standards have actual formal security analysis carried out against them.
Very good. Mike, Les, are we taking questions now or moving swiftly on to the next agenda item?
Happy to take questions now or at the end.
Okay.
So
one from Jin Wen just came in. Is there movement of Apta App within FAPI read write?
So that's a great question to ask me, Jin, because I think I wrote the definitive blog on App that's published on the Foundation's website. So App just works with FAPI. You don't need to do anything special. The conformance tests support App, although that often confuses people. What they actually do is web to app, which is close enough for the purposes of proving that App would also work. And yeah, the absolute brilliant thing about App is that it's just using the existing standards. You don't have to do anything special in the specifications to actually support App. It's just a case of using the operating systems provided claimed HTTPS URLs or deep links or app links or whatever your OS calls it, just leveraging that to make a flow that can go straight from one app to the other. So yeah, it all works, it's all good. We've seen many examples of App with FAPI, particularly in the UK. I regularly use it.
Any other questions? Hearing none, we'll move on to the next section, but if any come to mind, then feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'm sure Joseph will pick them up and try and respond in real time. So next, I'm happy to introduce Mark Heenan, the co-chair of the EKYC and IDA working group, which has been working quite rapidly since the beginning of 2019. So looking forward to hearing the latest update from you, Mark.
Thanks, Gail. I'd just like to reinforce one of the points Joseph just made, which is about Apta App. During his presentation, I actually paid my credit card using Open Banking UK and an Apta App redirect. So I can confirm it works in the real world as well. Thank you, Joseph. And to a certain extent, OpenID for identity assurance relies heavily upon FAPI as well. So it's really nice to have the update from those guys that's moving forward, because we're going to depend upon it very much for delivering security around the identity flows. With an open banking journey, it's about access to financial services, account information, or payment services. What we're doing here is extending the capabilities of delivering digital identity data. But really, this slide, the introduction was, why are we doing this? And that's because of the lack of international assured identity interoperability. We've been mentioning the interoperability word several times already, and there's lots of assured identity implementations and ways to communicate it, but basically none of them interoperate with each other unless you stay within the walled garden of a given software vendor. I think we think that having an open standard to do this achieves a lot of the benefits that Joseph was talking about in the context of FAPI, allowing you to buy bits of software off the shelf which are going to interoperate with each other at the end of the day. So, helping break down those islands of digital identity. Ultimately, we've got a burning business problem, negatively impacting everybody out there, but particularly end users and relying parties. And so they can't readily represent verified identity data that they did last week or even 10 minutes ago for it with a different provider. So we're trying to address the issue of the reusability of assured digital identity. And we've now, I'm really pleased to say, got to a point where it's ready for implementers, really ready for implementers. Next slide, please, Mike. The business case is about reducing friction, so making it easier for people to integrate things together, and the cost. So again, allowing you to buy off-the-shelf components, but also reducing ultimately the number of validation and verification processes that somebody needs to go through when interacting on the internet. I'm sure we've all been through the process of presenting identity documents of one sort or another, or evidence documents to give credence to the claim that we are who we claim to be. So, I think we'd really like to have an interoperable interface for digital identity, which goes a bit beyond the base claims of Mark Heenan or Gail Hodges. This is extending out to include information about how the end user's identity attributes were validated, and giving a much richer context to the consumers of that data, the relying parties, to make their decisions on whether to permit access to whatever service it is they're offering, whether it's signing up for a new account or account recovery or whatever. And ultimately, we want to deliver a handful of services that will be reusable by consumers, and hopefully resulting in fewer credentials, delivering on the dream of digital identity, hopefully. We're also doing quite a bit of work around helping relying parties define precisely what they need so they can achieve their obligations for data minimization when interacting with consumers. Which is driven by the use case they're performing. It's difficult for an identity provider to understand all the possible combinations of bits of data required for every relying party's use case. So we think it's quite important for the relying party to be able to communicate their needs in terms of attributes and metadata. Next slide, please. The main use cases that we're looking at are opening an account, doing some account recovery, perhaps staff onboarding, or accessing restricted services. And it's super cross-sector. So we're looking at government, healthcare, alcohol and tobacco, financial services, all sorts of things. We also think it needs to be something that can work pan-geographically and with multiple assurance process specifications. So there's I think some of the audience, I imagine, will be familiar with NIST 800-63-3, and others from the UK will be interested in and aware of GPG 45, which basically do the same thing from a high-level kind of capability perspective, but do it in a very different fashion. And we need to be able to express the results of those assurance processes in a way which is interoperable, but also takes account of the need for the different assurance standards to be presented in an interoperable way. Next slide, please. So right now, maybe we're being a little optimistic, but we think OpenID Connect for identity assurance is the best current protocol for this. We have scaled implementations today operating at national level. Two of which are fully live services and have been for a little while. It's also based on OpenID Connect, we know it's going to scale to internet scale, so there shouldn't be any concerns about that. I think another dimension which I didn't put on this slide is again it's scaled to meet high security requirements, because we can simply implement it using FAPI, and we do encourage people to do that in the spec, although not making it mandatory. As Joseph's been talking about conformance testing and self-certification, we also have that capability underway, and the great work of the conformance testing team in the OpenID Foundation is borne out here as well. We have that in beta for OpenID for identity assurance today, and we're looking to have that delivered for general availability Q1 next year. Ultimately, it's about increasing interoperability and reducing implementation cost, because there's effectively a place where we can all go to confirm that that an implementation matches up with the specification. When building an ecosystem, having a way to solve those arguments and to allow people to find out for themselves whether they've built it correctly really enables those ecosystems to be built effectively. It also, as the Brazil case illustrates, allows ecosystems to start requiring that self-certification has been performed, so that the participants can demonstrate that they are interoperable, reducing the cost and complexity for all the other implementers involved.
Would this, Mark, be a good time to talk to the links between blockchain or verifiable credential-based solutions and eKYC for IDA, like how this standard can incorporate a range of different technologies?
It could be. We're not directly attacking that part of the problem space,
Right.
but I think it's probably fair to say we don't preclude those things. So effectively, OpenID for IDA is acting as an interface to data, and there's no hard and fast specification about the architecture within which the interface for defining will be used. There's obviously work ongoing, which we're going to hear about later, to do with SIOP, and I don't see any particular reason why there couldn't be a SIOP implementation which uses the OpenID for IDA request response schema. Also, I don't see a problem with a given implementer exposing two different interfaces. One would be an OpenID Connect for identity assurance, OpenID provider service, and the other might be a wallet-based delivery of effectively the same verified data. So I think there's lots of different ways that we could coexist with other approaches such as verifiable credentials. I think the final one, which we might ask Torsten to talk about at some point, is the verifiable presentation side, which I think is closely allied and being worked on by him and Christina in parallel with the SIOP stuff, if I understand it correctly, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. Well, so thank you. And while we're on the topic of kind of adjacent technologies, maybe you can also speak to things like mobile driving licenses and government issued digital IDs more generally, which is another hot topic that I don't think we'll talk about a lot elsewhere, but those similarly could be complementary, right?
Yes, indeed. So I'm not too familiar with mobile driving license specifically, Gail. I think you're probably much closer to that than I am. Although we do have a co-chair on the working group who is involved in that as well, so Tony Nadlin. In terms of government-issued digital identities, I certainly know there's some activity in that space in the UK, where there's been consultation going on throughout this year from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, which strangely is responsible for digital matters in this regard. They have issued a bit of technical guidance of, at a very draft stage really, of how one might implement an interface to the proposed digital identity trust framework. And they've issued guidance for two interfaces, essentially, one being OpenID Connect for identity assurance and the other being a wallet-based credential model. And again, I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be any equivalent work going on, and potentially both interfaces get used to present or to present the verified identity data at the end of the day. And I think at times a transactional model like OpenID will suit a use case better, and at other times a verifiable credentials wallet-based solution will suit another use case better. So I think there's room for all of these options.
Thanks, Mark. I know I'm putting you on the spot like I was with Joseph, but what's exciting is that these conversations are really happening in real time, right?
Yeah.
You know, we're looking to kind of navigate all these movements, you know, as the foundation, and as many of the folks in the working groups are, you know, thought leaders in these various domains. We're trying to, as a foundation, make sure we have a sense of the wider landscape and how it all comes together, so that we can kind of help advise governments, you know, help make sure we're converging efforts and, you know, trying not to duplicate efforts in the ecosystem as a whole. So
well,
to do that.
Yeah, to that point specifically, Gail, the last bullet here is talking about the relationship between the technical implementation, which, you know, in our case is focused on OpenID Connect, but also the relationship between the technical implementation and the policy domain within which it sits. So the legal and regulatory requirements, all of the kind of process stuff that goes on behind, particularly when you're establishing a verified digital identity. So, you know, inside the protocol schema, we have a very clear link to a thing called the trust framework. And we have a very clear reference to a level of assurance, both of which are clearly you know, not technical concerns, but we want to make sure that there is that relationship between the technical domain and the surrounding legal, regulatory, contractual, or whatever that sits around it. And the way we're trying to build this out is to make that as flexible as possible, so it can fit in any context from a kind of policy perspective. As a little bit later on, maybe we could move to the next slide, Mike. It might be on the next slide. No, it's not on the next slide. So for those of you that I've been talking about the kind of the wider context here, but I didn't want to go into gory detail, but ultimately OpenID Connect, as I think a lot of you will know, is ultimately a signed claims passing protocol. I mean, we've got a lady here called Alice, born on the 1st of January, and that's a signed object. If you could build the slide, Mike. What we add with OpenID Connect for identity assurance is this added verification metadata. It should really be verification and validation, but for brevity, we've gone with verification. So, you know, how were Alice's claims verified? Who verified them? How were they verified? When, and what evidence may have been used in the verification? So we're adding that richness to the story of how Alice was verified and identified. Next slide, please. This is a example that we built up when presenting to the GSMA recently, an example response from an OpenID provider, an OpenID for IDA provider. We've got at the top here the link to the policy domain, so the trust framework and the assurance level are there. We've got identification of specific transaction and a timestamp on it, so that if there's a need to go back for, you know, an investigation, a dispute, or, you know, for audit purposes, that's available as well. And then we have blocks of evidence data presented here. The first one of which was containing details of a driving license, and that also describes that it was validated remotely at a particular time. And then we have, in this case for the GSMA, we tried to build up an example electronic record piece of evidence that was communicating that you know, the identity was verified using a mobile. The mobile number wasn't blocked. The last SIM swap was some time ago, and the resulting risk score, as determined by the provider, was low. All giving credence to ultimately the verified digital identity claims we have in that bottom section. Next slide, please. So in terms of status, we've got Implementers Draft 3 approved last month, which we're really delighted about, and it was a really positive vote for that, with no rejections of our proposed document. So that was really great. We're aiming to head towards a final specification towards the end of Q2 next year. We've already held our first interoperability testing event, also in November this year, so just last month. The conformance testing tool will be available early next year. It's already available in beta and is being used by early adopters quite a bit, with relatively few bugs in the tool and, amazingly, relatively few implementation issues, but also really pleasingly, it suggests that the implementation of this is perfectly plausible for a lot of organizations. Underpinning all of that, we have 2 production services in existence today with a lot of experience of delivering this in the wild. Through next year, we're going to be working on various topics. There's a great piece of work called Advanced Syntax for Claims that's going to be coming through as a separate draft. And indeed, after the presentation, I'll drop a link into a presentation and demo of that went on at the Auth Security workshop last month. Alongside that's another feature called Selective Abort and Omit, which is allowing a bit more determinism about what happens when specific claims are not available. We've got another draft focusing on behalf of cases that we're calling OpenID for Authority. Allows you to express information about when the end user has the authority to act on another party, on behalf of another party, whether that's a legal entity or another natural person. We're looking to address the challenge of appending verification. So, the end user may be asked to provide attributes that the identity provider doesn't yet have good confidence on. So there may be a long-running process required to verify and validate those claims, which could take it outside of the realm of a normal OpenID transaction. So we need to look at how to address the case where some long-running process needs to be undertaken before delivery of the claims. And then finally, we're looking at potentially profiles. That's just my word for it right now. I don't know if profiles is the right word, but effectively definitions of how to represent different identity assurance standards that exist. 2 that we're going to be focusing on to begin with are GPG 45, which is a UK specification for assured identity, and the identity assurance parts of 863.3 under NIST. And as we go forward with that, I expect we'll find some other standards in that domain that we may wish to create a standardized schema for representation of there. Next slide, Mike. I think that's it, yes. Okay, so I'm going to drop a couple of links into chat in a moment. One which is just the homepage for the working group. A second is a link to the current implementers draft 3 text, if anybody wishes to look through that in any detail. And the third is going to be a link to the Advanced Syntax for Claims presentation from the Auth Security workshop that's on YouTube. And if there's anything else that anybody would like to know, either reach out to co-chairs, so that's myself, Torsten, Nahiro, and Tony, or do come along to working groups on a Wednesday afternoon.
Fantastic, Mark. I mean, tremendous progress from the team in terms of all those deliverables already this year, and a really rich roadmap of features you're working on in the months ahead. I mean, personally, I think this concept of profiles, like moving beyond the reference to a particular legal framework and taking it into profiles that can help automate the work of this standard, I think is just phenomenal. I'm really excited to see how that evolves, and also excited to see quite how many people are voting with their feet to contribute to the standard and put forward use cases. Maybe you can pop into the chat a list of some of the use cases that the working group members are actively interested in. Some of the conversations started around financial services, but is obviously so much wider than that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
application and mobile network use cases and healthcare use cases and all sorts. So it's really exciting. And sometimes the facts on the page, misrepresent quite how exciting this is, and in a way unique across standards efforts right now. There's not really a competing alternative to this work. So it's really, really great time, really interesting stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, one other thing that I know that a little later in the event today was going to be talk about GAIN as well.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the more exciting areas. That's, for me, that's the manifestation of our ambitions, hopefully, where the GAIN, the Global Assured Identity Network, is going to try and work out how to take the output of OpenID for identity assurance and to make it into a functioning multinational service that that allows end users and relying parties to interact on a global level with other parties on the internet at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it can be for both, right? So an ecosystem or a self-contained ecosystem can adopt the standard for their own use, or they can engage in GAIN, to work on like networks of networks and like, a global interoperable approach. It really allows for
some other competitor of GAIN, who knows?
Yeah, right.
We're looking for that embarrassment of riches, right?
Exactly. Too many people implementing the standard.
Yeah. The other one that I might add, actually, just another comment that you made inspired this thought as well. We're trying to work alongside some of the standards bodies that exist in the policy domain as well. So the work that's been going on around the representation of GPG 45 has been done as part of a little. It's been kind of working group plus a project that has been active and is using OpenID for identity assurance in the UK. So the GPG 45 assurance standard that is being used has been developed between working group members and the OIX and UK government, essentially, and doing a version of that to standardize it. It's not just to allow easier implementation, as you were saying, Gail, but it's also in the future we may find a way to map things like a GPG level to a NIST level. It's non-trivial, but I know that the kind of OIX people are looking at that, and there may well be some partnership with Kantara around this domain as well. So there we go. I'll pass the baton on now, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you again, Mark. And obviously, anyone who has questions for Mark, please add them to the chat. And everyone's welcome to join that working group and help contribute to these deliverables. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
All right, welcoming back Joseph, now with your certification program hat on to talk about the status of certification. Thank you. Take it away.
Thanks, Gail. So I'll just aim to give a very quick overview of the certification program, and I'm aware that we're running a bit behind schedule, and I recognize many of the names on the participant list. So if I go too quick for anyone, do drop me an email afterwards and I'll fill in the missing bits. So the OpenID Foundation Certification Program is a lightweight, low cost, and importantly, a self-certification program, which is really designed to drive adoption of the standards and getting high quality, secure, interoperable, privacy protecting implementations out there. Program's been going for 6 years now, with the most recent addition being when we started to do financial grade API profiles 2 years ago now. And the list of certified people is freely available on the web. Anybody can look and see that you're certified, and even the results are completely open, so you can actually see exactly what did this call to the token endpoint look like, what parameters came back if you want to. It's a very transparent program. So next slide, please. So this is a quick graph I did, it doesn't go right back to the start of the certification program because we did a technology transfer last year where we had a historic suite written in Python and we replaced it with a Java suite that was more suitable to testing some of the newer protocols. So, but as you can see, the program is growing. The use of the suite is growing pretty much month by month, and you can spot when various banks had various deadlines from the peaks. And we're at over 1,000 certifications now, and this year pretty rapidly growing. So next slide, please. So I say the FAPI certification program is the big one at the moment that's drawing a lot of the attention. It very much focuses on interoperability, security, and correct deployment of certified software. So it's great if you can buy software from your vendor that's already FAPI certified, but unfortunately that's not the end of the story. It's still is a little bit of a challenge to actually get that software set up and deployed so that it is actually secure, and the FAPI conformance suite can actually help you do that. And it's always important to say about the FAPI test, they don't test all of OpenID Connect Core. We've got a separate test suite for that you should run if you support OpenID Connect Core. Next slide, please. So reasons to test are fairly obvious, I think, from much of what's been said before. Keeps your support costs down because things actually just work for third parties. You can show government regulators that you have actually made efforts to comply with the standards you say you're following. Can reduce insurance costs, certainly reduces your chances of a security breach. And if you don't test your server, there's a good chance someone else might and show you it's not conformant if it isn't. And unfortunately, there's a high chance it isn't conformant if you've not actually tested it. Next slide, please. So here's a slide that I change out each time. It's just showing an example of a failure that the suite has detected. This came from a production system. I'm not naming the guilty party. Yeah, I think we all know that these internet protocols make a lot of use of seconds since 1970 when describing times. Obviously, when you see a record that claims that it was updated in the 525th century, something is probably not working quite right. That's the example of things that the suite will pick up and will stop you being embarrassed when somebody asks you what's going on here. And it's the kind of thing you might not ever pick up through your own testing because there's actually not a clause in the spec that actually says you can't be a time traveler. Next slide, please. So yeah, I think between me and Mark, we've already said a lot about why you should use the program, but the main thing is that there's a whole certification team at the OpenID Foundation. We're domain experts, we're familiar with all the specs, we give people support, we're the people that maintain the specs. We provide a lot of feedback to the working group, which actually drives improving the standards of the quality of the standards, the understandability of the standards. And we also add tests when people find new ways to implement the protocol badly or new ways to abuse the protocol. And it's a positive feedback loop that makes things good for everybody. Next slide, please. So again, as we mentioned earlier, you really need to test both sides of the equation. The people sharing the data, the bank or the authorization server, and the receiving parties at the fintech, but they both need to run the test to get the full benefit. And if you think about the number of systems in an ecosystem with just 40 full participants, you've got over 1,500 distinct connections there. If a support ticket gets raised for half of those connections, you're in a serious amount of trouble. And the foundation is very happy to engage at the ecosystem and regulatory level and help people through some of these decisions and discussions and really share details. So if you're thinking about setting up a new ecosystem, please do come talk to us. Next slide, please. So the FAPI program has been going for a while, as I mentioned earlier. It's the UK that really led the way. The UK banks actually funded the initial development of the test suite that became the FAPI test suite, and we've been adding support for the different jurisdictions as they come up with particular further restrictions on FAPI. We'll continue to do that, and we'll also continue to push the working groups to get these things internationally standardized so that we don't have to do as much work to do that. So next slide, please. So the big effort this year has been on the Brazil open banking, which, as you can appreciate, with it having gone from just initially talking about adopting FAPI pretty much at the start of the year to actually having both data sharing and payments APIs live. It's taken up a significant amount of the certification teams and pretty much anybody else that's anywhere near Brazil's time this year. We've had 100 or over 100 banks certify in less than 6 months, which has presented its own challenges. That's I think we've probably had 100 certifications or less in the whole of last year. And Brazil just has some extra restrictions, which is why we have a Brazil-specific version of the specs. So because of their particular regulatory requirements, they need to restrict things a little bit further, and they have an intent pre-lodging mechanism that hopefully in due course will be replaced by pushed authorization requests and the grant management spec. So next slide, please. So just to review what we've done in 2021, at the start of the year, we welcomed a new team member to the certification team who's already making great impacts. We launched the Australian version of the FAPI Read Write Implementers Draft 2 specs, and we also added support for pushed authorization requests, which have always been optional in FAPI, but just with them becoming an RFC this year, we added that option to the test so people could be certified for that option in the standard. In June, we launched the FAPI 1 Advanced certification, so that's as the FAPI specs version 1 went to final. We had the tests out for those about 2 months after the specs went to final. And that's also when we started launching the Open Banking Brazil test, which included our first FAPI dynamic client registration test. In October, we put the relying party test for Brazil live. Had about 7 certifications for those so far, but more to come. November, we unfortunately had a team member who took a better opportunity, moved on to something new and bright, but we've also added 2 new members to the team who are very quickly coming up to speed and have been helping us really get through the Brazil certifications, which has been intense for the last month or so. And November was also when we launched the beta EKYC and identity assurance OP test that Mark talked about. So next slide, please. So almost on my final slide now. So just trying to show what we're going to aim to achieve over the next 6 months, which is still in a bit of flex as the board strategize and decide what we should be focusing on. But we're going to finalize the EKYC and identity assurance tests that we talked about. We're going to add relying party testing for FAPI-CIDA, as we only have identity provider testing for that at the moment. We're going to add a Brazil-specific profile to all the FAPI-CIDA testing because Brazil are going to start using FAPI-CIDA in March. FAPI-CIDA being that decoupled authentication flow that I mentioned earlier.
And I think, Joseph, we may also see some, sorry to interrupt, some development on shared signals and events testing, perhaps a little bit towards the summer or end of the year if we're optimistic, and maybe also for MODRNA, right? So we might talk more about that in those sections of the workshop. And also I thought maybe recertification might be something else in the outlook here, right? So how the board and the working groups are thinking about recommendations for recertification. not as a stick necessarily, but as a carrot to say what good looks like for recertification and to encourage recertification with guidance. So I put a note in the chat encouraging people to chime in and share their thoughts on what they think good might look like for recertification.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Gail. Yeah, we're this definitely won't be all we're doing in the next 6 months, but these are, I'm pretty certain we'll be doing at least these. So say, yeah, the other thing we'll be looking at is FAPI 2 baseline testing. We've just started to scope that and we'll maybe approach some organisations to see if they can provide a bit of directed funding to help get those done quickly. And we're also hoping to do some improvements to the submission process, just because there are some common mistakes that are made, and we have some ideas on how to remove the possibility to make those mistakes from the process and make things smoother for everyone. And I just have my, so go ahead, Gail.
This may also be a good time to just, as a public service announcement, I noticed Justin made a question around the cost of doing things. Just to remind everyone that the foundation doesn't view the certification program as a money-making venture. That's not our mindset. You know, the recommendations we make are not to line the foundation's pockets by any stretch. It's more to ensure that the work of the community, you know, reaches its full potential and supports the needs of, you know, our ecosystem participants. So any work that we do, we try and make as cost, you know, efficient as we possibly can, and try and over time bring down the cost, if anything, to how we deliver that work. And the same would be true for any recertification. So we'll start at what good looks like, you know, for the community's benefit, and then try and look at the model for how that's priced to be in keeping with the foundation's mission and values. But we do want anything related to certification to be as approachable as possible for all members of the community. Any questions or parting comments on certification, Joseph, or anyone?
I do have one final slide, if Mike can just flip over to it, which is just the closing one. So just the suite is open source, the code's all there, the instructions are there, you can start testing. There's a production deployment in the cloud you can just use, just log in with a Google or GitLab or any OpenID account. And, there's the details to contact us if you'd like some help. And yeah, that's me.
Thank you. Wonderful, Joseph. So moving swiftly on, Mike, how far off are we on the timeline here?
Oh, we're about 15, 20 minutes behind. So we need to make up some time, but we're doing questions in real time. So I'm confident we'll get caught up. I'm going to make Torsten presenter now, and he's going to lead his presentation.
Wonderful. A warm welcome to Mr. Lodderstedt. Thank you, Torsten, for joining us, the CTO of Yes.com and the co-chair of the NIDA working group, also the co-chair of the GAIN POC. So, Torsten, you have many hats, and happy to have you with us today talking about GAIN.
Thank you, Gail, and good afternoon, good evening to all of you. So what is GAIN all about? GAIN stands for Global Assured Identity Network, and it first was or is a white paper that more than 150 co-authors published back in September at the European Identity and Cloud Conference, and it suggests and proposes a blueprint from business, legal, and technical perspective to build a global network that can be used to access digital identity in an interoperable fashion across the globe. And the approach that we are proposing is very pragmatic. So we do not want to build new standards. We do not want to set up new standardization organizations. What we want to do is to interconnect existing identity solutions, local schemes, networks. So the statement there, therefore, is a building on what is built with those doing the building. And what we are focusing on is to ensure or to enable interoperability among those different solutions. And we have chosen to base that on a very simple architecture that is well known for those that have already been built working in the open banking space, where the relying party and the IDP interact directly with each other based on interoperable APIs. And we choose to use OpenID Connect, more specifically OpenID Connect for identity assurance for that purpose. And well, if there will be a need in the future to support other protocols, no problem at all. We are very pragmatic, and we are already talking about how we, for example, can support direct interactions with SSI-based solutions with protocols that are natively built to support the special characteristics of those solutions. The 5 standardization organizations involved in building GAIN are the Open Identity Exchange, who's focusing on the semantical interoperability and the governance aspects of such a network. The OpenID Foundation, focusing on the technical aspects and contributing the technical standards, but also being in the process of setting up what is called a community group, which is a completely new kind of undertaking. I will talk about that later on. Then we've got the Cloud Signature Consortium, a standardization body specializing in electronic signatures. We've got Cleave, who is well known for standards in the space of legal entities. We've got the IIF, which supports that efforts as a network of financial services leaders. And clearly, other standardization bodies are highly welcome to conduct that effort with us. Something about the roadmap in 2020. The work that we're planning to do will be conducted in mainly two areas. The OpenID Foundation is focusing on setting up a technical POC, which will interconnect prototypes of different identity providers and relying parties in a sandbox style environment. So we're not planning to go into production with that POC, but rather to use test data and test implementation in sandboxes to keep the legal aspect a bit simpler and focus on the technical interoperability among different implementations that come from different geographies, use different technologies and even different architectures. We have already started with what we call the Alpha POC out of the group of the authors of the GAIN POC as an ad hoc group, and I will report on our results that we have reached so far. And we're planning to set up a community POC group under the umbrella of the OpenID Foundation very soon. The Open Identity Exchange is right now gathering requirements for their work, which will be focusing on two aspects. First, what will be the governance rules and the processes for such a network? And second, how can we come to semantic interoperability, or at least how can we map the semantic of identity data between different jurisdictions? Because as you all know, identity assurance is bound to the law, basically, and it is very jurisdictional specific, sometimes even cultural. And beside the technical interoperability, we also need to find a way how a identity claim that was verified, for example, under the German anti-money laundering law, how that can be used to, for example, do an onboarding in Australia or in the US. And this is really a difficult challenge that OIX will try to cope with. And yeah, we're hoping that it will then be interesting, commercially interesting enough that one company or group of companies is gonna set up and take the endeavor to create a commercial instantiation of the network later on. Speaking about the alpha proof of concept, it started in around July this year. Is a small group of organizations that want to, in the first step, demonstrate that it is possible using existing technical standards to build a network where IDPs from different jurisdictions using different architectures and concepts can be exposed in a way to relying parties that those relying parties can obtain the identity data from those IDPs using the same protocol. And the group of identity providers, for example, contains BankID Sweden, which is a very, very successful identity solution, and Koya from the US, Crypto, which is an aggregator, very, very successful in the Nordics, especially in that space. The DITSME wallet from InfoCert is a SSI solution based on Hyperledger Indy. We've got SecureKey from Canada, and yes.com, who already runs or orchestrates an ecosystem with more than 1,000 banks using OpenID Connect for identity assurance. And for the relying party, and we also got some interesting relying parties that want to link up with those IDPs. Universign, Intesi are qualified trusted service providers. TrueLayer is an aggregator. OVLoop is a payment app, and Adobe, I think, is well known. As I said, we have been working on the first step, so to really integrate the different IDPs in the sandbox type of environment. Or we will be working on other aspects as well, such, for example, how do we manage the trust between the different parties in that ecosystem, and how do we, for example, conduct discovery and the selection of the respective IDP schools. And there are a couple of other topics. So we are right now in a process of discussing what the next topics will be, and everyone in the call that wants to contribute to this discussion or the group is highly welcome. There are a couple of events that are important to us, for example, this workshop, and we hope we can at any of those workshops also announce new results of our work. What I can tell you today is that last week during the Interop event, the EKYC Interop event, 2 of the participants, namely BankID Sweden and DITSME InfoCert from Italy, successfully completed the conformance test. So thanks to the conformance test team for providing us with those tests, and thanks to BankID and InfoCert for implementing the prototype and running the tests. So this means we successfully completed the first stage of that POC, and are looking forward for more IDPs to setting up their prototypes and the relying parties to integrating with those. We will increase the reach of that sandbox kind of environment, and anyone is invited to join the party and also build their prototypes on top of that. We hope that we can establish the official community group under the umbrella of the OpenID Foundation in January. The group will be governed by a new kind of agreement, since this is a new kind of group. So far, the OIDF had only standardization group that work on standards. We do not work on standards in that group. We want to implement standards and test those standards. And that also means we're interacting, or every participant interacts with services provided by other participants. So we need a clear legal basis for that. The scope and the roadmap of that group will be agreed upon in the group. We need to establish a respective government process, and we will do so. And we will collaborate with all the different streams, the other streams that are run at OIX and the other standardization parties. So if you want to reach out to one of the co-chairs, Mark Hain is one of the co-chairs. You already heard him presenting eKYC. Joseph Heenan, who just presented before me, is one of the co-chairs. We have Dima Postnikov from Australia, also as a co-chair, and I myself, I'm also a co-chair. Speaking just briefly about the architecture, as I mentioned in the beginning, we use a pretty simple architecture. We do not want to establish any intermediary, any layer on top of what is really needed to make the vision of the global identity network possible. So what we're assuming is that every relying party can directly interact with an identity provider. So we call it a direct access scheme. So this is all based on a trust management that we need to establish on one hand, and interoperable interfaces on the other hand. That's what we're going to build. And for an explanation of what OIX is gonna do, I would like to hand over to Mark.
Hi, thanks, Torsten. So the OIX is establishing a group within its organization called the Global Interoperability Working Group. And they're going to be looking at more of the policy domain aspects of establishing an assured identity network with international reach. One of the things that qualifies them in this space is that they've been spending quite a number of years already building something called the Guide to Trust Frameworks. And there's a reasonably well-established architecture for that domain, including a lot of the elements included on this slide. So things like mapping assurance levels, establishing a trust mark, principles of governance behind the trust framework, some legal and regulatory requirements, etc., etc. I think one of the things that is clear from their historical work and their ongoing work is that trust frameworks are really complex, and we really have to slice the elephant in order to eat it. There's going to be a decision in that group as well about which areas to focus on, what's key to allow interoperability between frameworks, because we think GAIN is likely to span across multiple kind of policy domains. And ultimately, they're going to be focusing on exploring the requirements to define what a global interoperability framework might look like, and discuss and collaborate with the OpenID Foundation community group on where policy ends and technology begins, and make sure that they mesh nicely. Next slide, please, Mike. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of this slide, but this is another view of the trust framework from an OIX perspective that Nick Mothershaw presents. He's the chair of the Open Identity Exchange. There's a couple of highlight areas that he wanted to just make sure that were called out for everybody when we were talking about this. One is, how to create an organization that delivers governance around this. Ultimately, trust needs to be anchored somewhere, and whether it's a non-profit, technology-agnostic international organization or something more commercially focused, it kind of needs to be decided at some point. There's the development of the interoperability framework that we were talking about in the previous slide. Aspects of how we're going to deliver identity assurance in an international manner. There's various different standards for level of assurance that we need to get over, and probably need to deliver assurance that is adequate for financial use cases. And then another area that perhaps spans the domains of the policy and the technical is this ecosystem actor trust. How does one party involved in the ecosystem know that the other party is part of the ecosystem and has met their obligations for participation? But I'll leave it at there in the interest of time.
Well, thank you, Mark. So if you wanna contribute, if you wanna join, you may directly reach us to one of those organizations. You see the email address of the GAIN POC in the lower part, or you may also reach out to one of the co-chairs. Thank you for your attention.
Super. Thank you so much to Torsten and to Mark for the updates on the GAIN proof of concept and some of the background of that work. So really exciting time there too. Were there any questions from the group for them before we move on to shared signals? All right, feel free to pop any questions into the chat that you might have for Torsten or Mark. And thanks very much, gentlemen, for your brief. Now we'll move swiftly on to shared signals and events. So happy to introduce Atul, co-chair of the working group, and delighted you're going to be able to share the current progress with the wider community here. Tremendous progress on shared signals as well, Atul. So please jump right in.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. Thanks everyone for having me. My name is Atul Tulshibagwale. I was with Google until now, but I have recently exited Google and I'm sort of on my own right now. Would like to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in the Shared Signals and Events Working Group. So for those who are familiar with the work of the group, you may be surprised that this first slide doesn't say anything about authentication or or account security. And that's because the framework that we're talking about here, the Shared Signals and Events framework, is a generic framework that that can actually be a framework for standardizing webhooks. As APIs get more and more important, there doesn't seem to be a standard way of implementing webhooks across all APIs. And for those, for the terminology, a webhook is a asynchronous way of communicating an update to a trusted party. And so let's say using an API you've called to obtain some state and that state has changed, how is that change of state communicated to the party that obtained that state with the API call? That is typically done using webhooks. And using the Shared Signals and Events framework, we think there is a great secure and privacy protected way of doing webhooks. So there's a little blog post about this, which I'm going to put in the chat for those who want to take a look at exactly how this will work. So you can go take a look over there. Now, fundamentally, the framework, the Shared Signals and Events framework, enables you to manage a stream of events, asynchronous events between a transmitter and a receiver, right? And these events are sort of discrete events. It's not like a continuous stream of bytes. They're packaged into these security event tokens or SCTs, and you can, as a transmitter or a receiver, you can manage the types of events that you're interested in, whether it's account security related or zero trust related, and I'll get into some of that soon. It also provides a good framework for managing subjects that are present in the stream. And this particular thing by which you can add subjects or remove subjects, you can also obtain consent from the user, like the subject themselves, if the application is appropriate. Like, for example, if you're trying to do something that is related to security of an organizational user, where the organization needs to control whether or not that subject is a part of the stream, you can avoid having to have the privacy consent from the user. But if it's something else about the user that you're exchanging and that you legitimately require the user to be making a consent for that information, then the standard will allow that. And how it does that is basically by the API that we have defined, the Shared Signals and Events Framework API, can be authorized using OAuth. And so by using certain scopes, you can get the OAuth consent from the user in order to authorize that particular call. Now, one of the things we've done in the specification is made the subject of the events, or the subjects that may be included in the events, very comprehensive. So what I mean by that is basically You can define users, devices, organizational units, tenants. You can make the subject as granular or as broad as you would like. The only requirement is that an event can be only about one subject. And so even if you're describing the subject using multiple sort of identifiers, we understand it's going to be an and of all those identifiers that defines the subject. I'm going to pause here. Second, I see something, a comment here. Thanks, Michael, for this comment. Okay.
I think it relates to gain, so I think it is on the prior conversation, a tool, so
Okay.
on the spot there.
All right. Okay, no worries. So next slide, please. Okay. So current applications of the shared signals and events framework, and this sort of goes back to the roots of how we came up with this framework. As you might know, the first standard in this group, and the group itself was called the risk group, which was mainly about account security. And that specification defines things like a credential change is required, or an account has been disabled or enabled, and we are now adding a credential compromise event to that. And so that's a set of events that you can look for or send that relate to account security, and that comprises the risk specification, the risk profile specification. And the newer work that we've done, which is the continuous access evaluation profile, what we used to call the continuous access evaluation protocol, which is now just a profile of the shared signals and events framework, enables zero trust. And how it does that is basically by enabling, specifying events that relate to session management or session security, or things that can dynamically change about a user based on their current authentication into a service. So these events may include things like, device compliance change, for example. So if a device has, was compliant and the user is logged into some service, but now later on the device management service finds out that the device is no longer compliant, you then can send an event saying that this device is no longer compliant, and then the service that has logged in the user may determine that, okay, that means that the user needs to take some remediation action, get onto a device that is compliant or something like that. So similarly, there are token claims change events that can be used to indicate things like a user has gone from one location to another. There is the credential change event. There's also an assurance level change. So if a user has gone from sort of a single factor to a two-factor assurance for the authentication in this session, then that can be conveyed as well. So these are all the events that the CAPE profile specifies, and I talked a little bit about the risk profile as well. Next slide, please. There's a glorious omission here, but I'll get to it. So obviously the group is very active. We are meeting every week nowadays, and I'll get into what we're doing these days. But some of the big companies involved are here. The one that I forgot to mention in this slide is Amazon, which is also a co-chair of the group, and so lots of activity happening here, and we'll get into what that is. Next slide, please. All right, so where we are today. So we have an approved implementers draft for the framework, the shared signals and events framework, and the CAPE specification. So, but what we're doing now is, after we've released the first implementers draft, we realized that there are some limitations that we would like to overcome, and one of the big ones there is we would like to have multiple streams of events between the same transmitter and receiver. So for example, if there is a service that only is interested in the zero trust events, like the CAPE events, and not the risk events, then they should be able to have a separate stream, and maybe within the same receiver there is another service that that wants to look at the risk events and not the CAPE events. So based on that, what we determined that maybe we should have a way of defining multiple streams between the same transmitter and receiver, and that sort of makes it a little more REST API like. The shared signal SSE framework API would resemble a more closely a REST API, a conventional REST API, and so we're working on that right now. We're making some small changes to the risk specification. So there is an existing implementer's draft of the risk specification that has been around for a while, from before the shared signals and events specification came to be. Now, what we're doing is we're in the process of creating an implementer's draft for the risk specification, but we want to make sure that and there's some discussion about this, about whether we should make it compatible and allow sort of existing behavior that some existing risk transmitters support. And then we've also added a new credential compromised event, which enables independent parties to sort of watch for compromised credentials on the net and then signal that to those who may be interested in that. So this is kind of the work we're doing in the working group right now. And like Gail mentioned, there are some additional things that we are considering as these implementations come forward. Is to do maybe an interoperability test, have a test suite that can be sort of available to participants to test their implementations and things like that. But we are not sort of actively working on that right now, but those are things that we think we'll get to very shortly. Next slide, please. Right, and so even though these standards are relatively new, I'm really happy to talk about the adoption it has received so far. And so the first one that I can talk about is the Google cross-account protection service, and they have millions of risk events being sent every day to hundreds of thousands of relying parties, and that's been around for I think a couple of years at least now. Now, last year, I think Microsoft announced the release of the continuous access evaluation feature, and that's supported between their major services that are described here. And based on just how busy these services are, I presume that the volume is pretty large, and that includes the CAPE events being sent from Azure AD to these other Microsoft services. And they're also considering extending that to partners. Now, the latest development here, which is a very exciting development, is that Cisco has launched an entire website dedicated to shared signals and events. And I've put the URL of that website here. It gives a good primer. It gives sort of details of all the events and how you can receive or transmit them. And so it's a great place to get started with shared signals and events. And lastly, SailPoint has released an open source library that implements the SSE data model, and so you can use those open source components in your code to implement SSE more easily. That's all I had. I think I may have finished a little before my time, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Atul. Really tremendous progress. And I wanted to see if any of your colleagues on the Shared Signals and Event Working Group wanted to chime in. Maybe Adam Goodman from Cisco. Did you have any comments, anything Atul didn't cover, or maybe you can speak a little bit more about the website that was just launched by Cisco?
Sure. I think the first thing I want to say is just briefly why we're excited about this. And it's You know, a lot of people say identity is the new perimeter, and through protocols like OpenID Connect, identity providers can act as a single point of enforcement for security controls across an entire organization. But the problem is that once a user has logged in and been logged into a relying party, you sort of lose that visibility. And the only solution in the past has been short session times, force users to log in again and again and again. So we see one of the outcomes of shared signals is going to be a much better solution for this, which makes for a better user experience and for better, more real-time security, visibility, and control for organizations. So we think this is a fantastic effort. Cisco had actually, and Duo Security, which was acquired by Cisco and where I came from, had actually been a little bit involved in the early days of CAPE. Honestly, through some staffing changes, we kind of dropped that thread for a while, but we're really happy to be back.
Okay, thank you so much, Adam, for chiming in. Were there any other comments from other members of the working group? Now I'll echo Don Tebow's sentiments in the chat. Thank you so much, Atul, for your leadership of this effort over some time. You and your working group chairs. It's been a wild ride, and what I personally observe as often best practices within a single organization, often a larger organization, we're now really creating the path through the standard for that really ingenious work to be shared then across different entities. And I know these are just the first signals that you guys have mapped out, but these create the building blocks, and using the OpenID Connect rails, as Adam was saying, to push these kinds of signals and potentially richer information over time. So really exciting opportunity, and something which I think is drawing the attention of different networks as well, like different types of networks of entities, to be like, how can we consume this, right? How could it add value to what we're doing? So hopefully we'll gain more traction, more members contributing to the standards development, and then chipping in on that the reference application and the interop testing that you guys are working towards. Best case, I think it was next summer. Some of your peers were saying they'd love to see if an interop would be possible in that time frame. Any other final thoughts, Atul, before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the shout out, but I'm really privileged to be with such great colleagues on this working group from Microsoft, Amazon, Cisco, and other companies. It's just great working on this group. So
yeah, fantastic, a great crowd. All right, thank you so much, Atul. And let's move on to Tim Kapali on the Fast Fed. Tim, if we got you on there, make sure we got your video. I was worried. There he is. Can you hear me, Tim?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So Tim, thank you so much. Obviously, you're working on some of the shared signals as well. So if you've got any thoughts on that before we jump into FastFed, feel free. But thank you so much for the leadership on the FastFed work. Looking forward to hearing the status there.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. We can go right into it, Mike. So I want to start out. We haven't given a FastFed update in quite some time. So there's a lot of folks on the call. So I figured we'd do a quick rundown of what FastFed is and why we think it's so important. The very short one sentence pitch is that it's a protocol to simplify configuration and lifecycle of federated relationships between identity providers and application providers, right? So some of the top pain points that exist, that we hear about constantly in our feedback at Microsoft is, these admins that are not necessarily SAML experts or SCIM experts or OpenID Connect experts have to do all of this copying of identifiers they don't understand, and maybe they shouldn't even have to understand them, right? These are very protocol specific things that the average person that just wants to set up a quick federation between an enterprise app because they want to take advantage of single sign-on and a central provider and all the security that it gets, they shouldn't have to go read a spec or have to understand what an entity ID is, for example. So metadata exchange for these protocols is covered by FastFed. It handles SAML certificate rollover, which I'm sure everyone on this call has at least knows someone who's been burned by a SAML signing cert change, right? It's hugely painful, often not well communicated by both sides of the equation, right? So it's that's a huge value of the spec, and it also will take care of configuring SCIM, right? So we're seeing, as you may know, the SCIM working group at IETF has been newly recreated. It's respawned, which is amazing, and there's a lot of new work going on there. So there's a lot of interest in SCIM in the market. If you're not familiar with SCIM, just acronym soup here. So that's essentially how you provision users and groups to another party, so that you don't you don't have to rely on like just-in-time provisioning. So we can go to the next slide. A quick visual of what this looks like in conversational form. It's deliberately leaving out a ton of steps. It's really meant to be high level, right? If we look to the right-hand side of the screen here in step one, an application admin. So let's just use, let's use AWS and Microsoft, right? Like, so Microsoft's the identity provider, AWS is the application provider. I want to use my Microsoft credentials to sign into AWS. The AWS admin, right? That could be a very low privileged admin, right? The goal of this is to provide federation to the masses, assuming someone approves it or they have the right privileges. But this could be just an application admin on the AWS side says, hey, AWS, please federate with Azure AD as the identity provider. And here is my email address that I use with Azure AD. Maybe you can go discover automatically how to federate, right? So that's one way you can discover that. The other way would be like AWS having a drop-down box that says federate with Azure, right? So there's a couple of ways. We're not going to dig into that, but there is an opportunity for it to be discoverable, which is super important. So at this point, the application provider essentially reaches out to the IDP. So AWS reaches out to AAD and says, hey, please federate with me. There's a lot of business logic that can now happen depending on implementation policies, privileges, et cetera, that may instantly approve it based on knowing who the user is after they signed in on the IDP side. It may go through some type of governance pipeline to say, hey, this user is requesting this app to be privileged. This is not an approved app, blah, blah, blah. All that fun governance stuff that we won't touch into. But ultimately, let's assume that the IDP admin in step 4 says yes. A bunch of handshakes happen back and forth between Azure AD, let's say, and AWS, the IDP and the application provider, and ultimately set up whichever protocols were requested, right? And I want to call this out because I hear Vittorio. It's not just SAML, right? There is actually an OpenID Connect profile that we're working on for the purpose of the diagram. It would have been weird to put SAML and OpenID Connect together, but it could be, generally it's going to be SAML or OpenID Connect and then SCIM, and maybe some other things which we'll talk about in a second. So that's kind of the really high level flow of how this works. Very oversimplified. But that, I think that the goal, right, is that this is all really a administrator on either side would really have to understand unless they wanted to dig into the details. So we can go to the next slide there. Just wanted to highlight who's involved in this group, and very great timing. We recently had some new folks. So the active participants have been Microsoft, AWS, and Google. And just recently, Okta joined the mix, which is awesome. Vittorio's been already providing feedback, which is awesome. And Signal, which is a startup from someone who actually came from the Google effort, is also now involved. So we've had a lot of continuity, especially between the three kind of older participants, which has been great. We've been able to keep it intimate in a way to really fix problems quickly in the spec. And so we're excited to bring in some other folks to start talking about how we scale and start getting implementations going so we can really figure out any problems that may exist in the spec. So go to the next slide. So what are our agenda for 2022? We're pretty much wrapped up for the year. We've been meeting every other week, which we've kind of increased our meeting cycle given the buzz, right? There's a lot of excitement about this. Some of the work items we want to handle are, we want to be able to handle the fast-fed handshake, right? The admin/management relationship with OpenID Connect, right? So, for historical reasons, which I'm not going to get into, right? The spec did leave out how you actually authenticate the exchange and do consent and all that fun stuff. An interesting parallel to something we're running in with SSE as well. Like the two specs deliberately don't touch on that. But what we're finding is, the reality is if you don't specify that it becomes a bit too ambiguous in the FastFed world. So what we're doing is we're going to try and take things that are just assumed, JOT trust with JWS URIs. We want to actually take that and use things like signed request objects in OpenID Connect to communicate the FastFed metadata URI so it can't be modified. That's kind of one example of what we want to do. So that is like literally, we just accepted that kind of as a work item yesterday. We at Microsoft have been kind of proposing some ideas, so that'll be probably the active discussion for the next few months. We want to improve IDP initiated flows, right? So we've kind of assumed that the admin is going to start at the application provider. So in the example I used earlier, AWS, we want to make sure that the spec is consistent with handling if you start at the IDP side on the Azure AD side, for example. So there's nothing preventing you as the spec is written today from doing that, but we do want to add some more text to make that a little bit more consistent. And it may end up being non-normative text. We just want to make sure it's in there. Obviously, addressing implementers draft feedback. That was, Victoria already provided a ton of feedback from Okta, which was amazing. As the SCIM working group gets going, we want to address SCIM authentication that was left, kind of off, not in scope in the first iteration of FastFed, the first implementers draft. Now that the SCIM working group is rechartered, we hope the two groups can work together to further define that. Now, to add some more confusion, we realized this on the call yesterday, the FastFed OpenID Connect profile, which is to provision for FastFed to provision OpenID Connect, that is kind of stuck in a draft state. It never went to implementers draft. There was a lot of open questions, and I think a few years ago, the realization was that most people that were going to use this to start were SAML customers. But it is super important if we think about what FastFed can do long term. It is super important, obviously, to have OpenID Connect support, because the way we envision this, at least at Microsoft, is to be able to have an easy way for an admin to transition from SAML to OpenID Connect. And so if FastFed can support both and can handle that transition, we've removed a significant amount of pain that exists today with, people, a lot of people are just like SAML work, set and forget. I think there's a lot of things people don't like about SAML. We want to move on to do things that are shiny and great. What if we had this really awesome way to flip a bit and transition over? So that's super important. Not to mention, obviously, the customers that are using OpenID Connect to start. And the new item we want to think about, we may not get to it in 2022, I hope we can, but we want to be able to actually set up SSE, right? If you saw my SSE session at the previous workshop, I kind of had a circle of kind of some of these protocols and how they relate. We really see SSE as kind of finishing the circle, right? So we have FastFed, we have OIDC or SAML, we have SCIM, and then we see shared signals events with CAPE and risk events as really filling out that life cycle and pipeline. So we want to be able to configure that automatically, because what we've realized in all of these discussions is we really see FastFed being deployed in one of two ways, right? One is the big SaaS to big SaaS deployment, right? So like the AWS to Azure AD example, right? That is a very, very static, very it's not going to change often. It's going to be used by millions of people, right? So that is very different than I am a random, a very small app developer just creating a one-off solution that wants to federate easily and needs to take advantage of some more of those discovery features, like putting in a web finger discovery, for example. So we're essentially, we want to be able to bring SSE into this mix to say, hey, we can offer kind of a full stack solution for a developer to integrate with these identity protocols via FastFed, right? So we're really excited about that. And the way the FastFed spec is written, very similar to the way the SSE spec is written, is all of the things that you want to support on top of FastFed, like SAML, OpenID Connect, SCIM, or SSE, those are all profiles, right? So you don't necessarily have to change the core spec, similar to SSE versus CAPE and risk, which is really exciting. And the last one, thanks to Gail pressing us, we need to get some industry engagement, right? So Gail has been amazing at pushing us to have these conversations externally, things that we probably don't do too often on our own. So appreciate all the help, Gail. So we want to get more people involved. As more and more companies are starting to build and test, we obviously want to be able to have something like an interop event as well at some point. And there's a bunch of industry events that are conducive to being able to do some interop and demo. Identiverse is one great example. People tend to show awesome integrations at Identiverse. So it'll be a very busy year in 2022 for FastFed. I'm excited. We're got a lot of momentum. And I think that's my last slide. I put these together a couple of days ago. Oh yeah, and just some resources if you want to find the specs and the public home. We've been cleaning up the Bitbucket. So there's if you go to the wiki, that's where all the meeting notes are now. They were kind of scattered before. So you can kind of treat that as it's public, but the more of the working group landing page.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim, for the helicopter view. And while people are snapping those pictures, I don't know, Mike, you might want to put those QR codes back up if they're still snapping pictures. I wanted to see if any of the other working group members had comments they wanted to make. Jones, you put your video on. Maybe you wanted to jump in? Or you're gonna, he's getting ready for his slide. Okay. So were there any other comments from the working group members they wanted to chime in on anything Tim didn't cover? If not, I've got my own question or two as well. So I'll jump into my question, Tim. So has the working group contemplated any way of A/B testing the impact of the work that you're doing as you go along? Right, because as you mentioned, some of these are very large entities accustomed to A/B testing and deploying and maybe parts of their implementation to see whether the hypothesis is proving out. All these efficiencies that are promised by this development of the standard, whether that's proving out in terms of real time saved, real adoption, and real growth of new admins using the service. Like what have you contemplated that? Is that something we could stare at?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we do know is at least at Microsoft, this is one of the top I don't want to say complaints. It's one of the top areas of improvement that customers report. So we do know that when this is ready, even for just, let's say, AWS, that will go a long way in solving pain points. I think on the A/B testing side, I think the nice thing with I do love big working groups, but I also like small working groups. The nice thing with us being a little bit more intimate right now is we can iterate much quicker. We can have engineering teams building in parallel to meetings and then coming back and talking, similar to what we've recently started doing with SSE, right? It's been very agile and flexible. So I imagine, yes, the answer is yes, that will exist. That's exactly.
Yeah, okay, cool. Well, I think as Mike is probably about to share in a minute, what we see with something like OpenID Connect with millions of applications using it and billions of users, sometimes the big numbers or showing the big impact and growth, really will resonate. So if you guys are thinking about sharing some key messages at Identiverse on your progress, I think that would be really fantastic for members like those that are on the call today, as well as the wider community, to see what it means to them. So thank you for that. I also was particularly interested in that SAML work, and I see, Vittoria is still on. There's been some discussions on how we can support the SAML community or entities that might want to migrate from one to the other. How do we do that? I thought that was really interesting that you guys are thinking about a path for how that could be achieved in FastFed. I think strategically relevant, to how we support the wider community and our friends in the SAML crowd, because I don't view it as competitive. I view it as how can we help.
Right, and that's exactly the way we look at it. Like, I think most people on this call probably have very strong feelings about SAML, and I think this is a great opportunity for us to provide a transition mechanism. More excuses, right?
Yeah,
it's
right.
a quick button.
It fits for them, right?
Exactly.
Perfect, Tim. And without further ado, any other questions, pop them in the chat. And Mike Jones, wonderful to have you again speaking to OpenID Connect and the progress to date.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Gail. So I'm here representing two working groups, the OpenID Connect working group and then the EAP working group, which I'll talk about right after that. So you're almost certainly using OpenID Connect. That's no surprise to this audience. This is such a small subset of the groups using it that it's not even representative, but it does give you some idea of the data points that are out there. A key decision, unlike OpenID 2.0, OpenID Connect is not a consumer brand. It's just infrastructure that we all take advantage, of. I learned that AT&T was using it when I went to pay my DirecTV bill and saw the protocol flow. It's just there. So a long time ago now, we had a set of specs, which we finished in 2014 based on a bunch of other specs that we were doing in the IETF at the time. But that's not the end of the story. This is a really exciting time now for the OpenID Connect working group and effort. There's more happening right now than has ever happened since the original specs were developed. And I'll try to give you a taste of some of that work in the slides to come. So our friend logout, there's 3 approaches to that, and as well as being able to initiate logout from an RP. Those are stable, but not yet final. We plan to make those final pretty soon. That said, there's a whole discussion about how some of the changes in the browser landscape can affect 2 of the 4 specs. Not going to go into that here, but there's a whole set of work that Tim and others can tell you about. The OpenID Connect Federation spec is pretty mature. It's used to create large-scale federations among participants within a trust framework. And it defines hierarchical JSON-based metadata for doing that. That's as opposed to the SAML federations like in Common and whatnot, which for the most part just concatenate everybody's metadata together into one XML file and publish it nightly. Like the initial Connect spec, we've done a bunch of interop work on this. We just got a 3rd implementer's draft, and we look forward to this being final pretty soon. There's 3 really small specs that nonetheless do worthwhile things. One enables account creation as part of the authentication flow, and initial implementer's draft review of that starts this week. There's a native single sign-on spec that enables single sign-on across apps by the same vendor on mobile platforms. And George Fletcher requests your feedback on that, as does the working group. There's an unmet authentication requirements spec that adds a new error code for particular use cases that lets the OP signal that it failed to authenticate the end user per the relying party's requirement. Torsten in the working group requests your feedback on that one. There's a claims aggregation spec, fleshing out the aggregated and distributed claims use cases and enabling those to be more actionable. That was initiated by Matt Sakamura and Edmund J, and the working group likewise requests your feedback on the state of that. A big piece of work, which is going to be giving its own talk by Christina later today, is self-issued OpenID provider V2 work. Like the initial one, it lets you be your own identity provider. But unlike the initial one, it extends the functionality so that you can get the keys from more places than just the initial protocol message, including from decentralized identifiers, DIDs. And it's defined how to integrate that with verified claims in multiple kinds of formats. I'll note that SIOP is being used in the ISO mobile driver's licenses ecosystem. And the working group decided a week ago to start the initial implementer's draft review of that spec. And as soon as we get a few more review comments integrated, that'll start up probably early next week. Another draft in the same state that we're about to begin an implementer's draft review is the OpenID Connect for verifiable presentations. that says how to use the W3C verifiable presentations objects in conjunction with OpenID Connect. That could be with a standard third-party identity provider. It could be with a self-issued identity provider. Finally, filling out this sort of trio, there's also a new spec for verifiable credential issuance. So remember that in the verifiable credentials ecosystem, issuance is separate from presentation. This describes the issuance phase. The previous describes the presentation phase. And that is in process of initial adoption by the working group. Actually, I should fix the slide to say it just was adopted by the working group. Boring, but nonetheless important, is fixing typos and missing S's in HTTPS and the like. There are errata specs for all the final OpenID specs, core, discovery, registration, and we need to finish the second errata set. You've already heard about the OpenID certification program, so I won't talk about it more here, but that's been important to the OpenID Connect ecosystem, such that making high quality, secure, and interoperable OpenID Connect implementations the norm. We learned from, among others, the SAML certification program, how valuable that was in making the implementations work better together. And we've done a lot for both Connect and FAPI. So there's a number of related working groups, many of whom you're hearing from today. I won't belabor this, but I will post the slides both on my blog and they'll be posted on the meeting website. And I'll conclude this report out with a set of links where you can learn more about what we're doing. With that, I will pause to see if there's questions we want to take, and then I will switch working groups.
So I would only just chime in to say, Mike, I think it's, as you said up front, this is a more mature standard, but there is so much activity going on, right? Like the growth and the adoption is so widespread. One of the more recent kind of proof points of that was that the entire US healthcare system is implementing OpenID Connect, for the sharing of medical records. It was actually Apple that played a role in encouraging the medical community to adopt OpenID Connect for that use case, and also being used in a piece of work by Health and Human Services. So at least in the US, that's a really big deal. And that's just one of the many examples that we keep hearing, right, around how it's being adopted sometimes without us even knowing, or people being intimately involved in the development of the standard. So it's got a life of its own and a real success. So thank you for your stewardship as a co-chair, Mike.
And there are dozens and dozens of active contributors that play a really important role in both stewarding our responsibility for the existing specs and evolving the Connect ecosystem to meet new and important use cases. All right, with that, I'm now going to switch presentations to talk about the Enhanced Authentication Profile Working Group. So the EAP Working Group is chartered to develop security and privacy profiles of Connect for strong authentication. And there were two ways in which it was chartered to do that, which are reflected in two specifications. One has to do with the use of the IETF token binding RFCs. which had become somewhat moribund, but I'll talk to that in the next slide. The other is active, which is about defining authentication context class reference values. By the way, another feature that we borrowed from SAML intentionally. And I'll talk about that spec. The implementers drafts of both were finished 2 years ago. So without talking much more about token binding, after it was pulled out of some of the browsers, what looked like a promising proof of possession mechanism for TLS connections ended up falling into disuse. And so unless that decision is changed by the browser vendors, we don't plan to continue doing any updates to this spec. The happier news is that the ACR value spec is active and in use. It defines 2 classes of kinds of authentication. One is phishing resistant, such that you don't have something that you can capture and replay with a man in the middle. And the other is a variant of that, which is that the phishing resistant method is backed by something that's also hardware protected. And I'll note, just as a piece of OpenID Foundation history, that the phishing resistant definition was actually written in 2008 for an extension to OpenID 2.0, which you can still read about, and we reused that definition in this spec. So a recent development for this spec is at the request of Christian Brand at Google, we also defined a new authentication method reference value. So ACRs are sort of business groupings of functionality. AMRs are specifics of what was actually done. You can read about that in the RFC referenced, but in particular, while there were existing values saying that you used a hardware-backed key or a software-backed proof of possession key as part of the authentication, there wasn't a generic one saying you just used some kind of proof of possession key. And I know that Christian and others wanted to use that to say that, for instance, if a FIDO authenticator was used, whether or not it's backed by hardware or software, you could say that proof of possession was used. And by the way, that would also apply if you used a certificate form of authentication, another form of phishing resistant authentication using a proof of possession key. So that's done. So Brian Campbell and I chair the working group. And probably the next thing to happen is to go for a second implementer's draft of the AMR spec, because we added the POP AMR value, of the ACR spec because we added the POP AMR value. And you can, like all the rest of the working groups, see the working group page to learn more about what we're doing or how to participate. With that, I believe I finished this one early, and unless there's questions, I will return the time to the meeting so that we can get closer to on track.
Super, thanks, Mike. Not hearing any immediate questions. We'll ask for any comments in the chat. And thank you for that review. I was learning something and pinging Mark Heenan about some stuff offline. So thank you for the update on where that track is. Next, it looks like we have Bjorn next on deck. Christina, I think you're going to be just after that. So Bjorn, thank you for an update on MODRNA and the progress to date.
Okay, very good. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I think we can hear you just fine. And maybe perfect. Mike Les, you can put in the chat how much time we should put towards MODRNA and Christina's work on SciApp, so we try and stay on time for the rest. Thanks, Mike.
I will monitor the chat and I'll get started. Okay, so this is the MODRNA working group. The purpose of the working group was to support the GSMA technical development of the Mobile Connect standards, as well as similarly industry and standards development. To enable mobile network operators to become identity providers and to develop a profile and extension opening for use by MNOs to provide identity services. Next slide. So we have a variety of contributors and participants in the working group. It's a healthy split between mobile network operators as well as vendors. And so I listed the logos of the companies that have or has participated and contributed to the various specs that the working group has produced. Moving on to next. So working group status. The working group recently approved or got approval for their final publication of the CIBA core spec. So the working group had started a CIBA specification based on a use case from Telefonica and Orange. This CIBA flow was later adopted or seemed useful for additional use cases, such as the ones developed by the FAPI working group. So we went through and revised the initial implementer's draft of the CIBA spec and created a CIBA core specifications, and then had various profiles created for the specific use cases. So the CIBA core has been approved for final publication. We have 3 specifications that are currently in implementer's draft. That's the authentication profile, account porting, and the user question API. And we are in the process of preparing the MODRNA CIBA profile for implementer's draft vote. It's probably going to happen beginning of January. So that is the CIBA profile for the MODRNA use case. There is a similar FAPI CIBA profile in the FAPI working group. The working group is also advancing the remaining drafts, the discovery profile and registration profile, to implementer's draft status. We're doing that as we are receiving feedback from deployment in Europe, mainly Spain, as well as US. And so, as you heard from Mike Jones of his AT&T experience, that is a Zenki deployment using OpenID Connect and MODRNA profiles to support those use cases. And that's part of the feedback that the group is getting. We are also working on how to create a certification for the various profiles that the working group has created. You can find information about all the specs and their status and the hyperlink at the bottom of this slide. Moving on to the next. So the MODRNA group has several collaborations and or outreach. Going to the next. So one is the obvious, the GSMA. And so there are several areas where we're working with GSMA. The first obvious one is the Mobile Connect architecture and its offsprings. Again, there are multiple implementations of Mobile Connect or Mobile Connect-like deployments throughout the world. There's also OpenID Connect supported in the rich communication services specifications. And one area that we're looking at now is what's called messaging as a platform. And it's a GSMA's RCS map version of a chatbot. There's also use cases within GSMA for how to onboard a device that leverage OpenID Connect for a user interaction. Next slide. So recently we had a joint workshop with, well, we had joint workshops with the GSMA. And the first one was on October 28th, where Gail and myself presented a strategic overview of the identity landscape for the benefit of the GSMA and MNO community. We had a second workshop on November 29th that was more in technical nature, where we went over various OpenID Foundation standards and development that could be of use for MNO or GSMA use cases. Besides MODRNA, we covered OpenID Connect for identity assurance, the grant management spec, shared signals and events, and FAPI, as well as the GAIN POC. At the bottom, there is a link to a page where you can find the presentations from these two workshops. Moving on to next. So we have another interaction with the 3GPP. And so for those not familiar with third generation partnership project, they develop the 3G, 4G, and now 5G standards that are the basis for the wireless networks being developed or deployed, or have been deployed for pre-5G. 3GPP is a collaboration among multiple national SDOs. And they have developed a architecture for mission critical services to support first responder and other public safety agencies. In that architecture, there is an identity management function, because in order to get access to this mission critical domain and get priority in terms of service, you need to perform user authentication. And so 3GPP had developed a OpenID Connect MCX profile. And our interaction with 3GPP is to be more involved in maintaining that profile. Based on the work that 3GPP did on mission critical services, they also developed or started developing something called the service enabler architecture layer that will support multiple types of vertical applications, whether it's vehicle to anything or UIV or drones. So identity management is a common capability in the seed or vertical applications, and will continue to evolve. And the hope is that the foundation is more involved in how these profiles are being evolved. And that takes me to my last slide. Well, so I am done.
Very, very speedy indeed. Thank you so much. So I'm glad you walked through the latest on mobile and MODRNA, but I think what we're also observing is that there's interest in these use cases or in the standards of the OpenID Foundation more broadly amongst entities like the GSMA and ETSI, that there's that interest for things like Mobile Connect, where it may be more direct use of a profile like MODRNA, but there's appetite within the wider mobile network community for many of the initiatives that the OpenID Foundation is working on. That was my takeaway, right, Bjorn?
And ETSI is a member of 3GPP, and so I didn't mention ETSI in this slide deck, but there will be something that the foundation and MODRNA will also be involved with in terms of interaction or outreach.
Absolutely, yeah. So Bjorn and I are working together to make sure those relationships, GSMA and ETSI and 3GPP, are where we need them to be, and that we have that open communication and they're up to speed on the work that's happening over here, and that we're complementary to the work that they're doing respectively. So thank you. Thank you very much, Bjorn. If anyone has questions, please do pop them in the chat for Bjorn. All right.
Thank you.
So moving on to Christina and OpenID Connect for SSI. Christina, thank you for your co-chairing of this the sub-working group of OpenID Connect, and clearly an area of interest for many members of the wider community. Those, I think, in the room as well as those that are outside. You know, what is the art of the possible for using OpenID Connect for this type of use case? So thank you. Please, let's jump in.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks everyone for staying until this time. So yes, the special calls are still called SIOP, self-issued OP calls, but the thinking, the specs have evolved a lot. So now it pretty much consists of three specifications, a group of specifications consisting of three called OpenID Connect for SSI. So let me talk to you about that. So this is an initiative conducted in liaison with Decentralized Identity Foundation. So we have a lot of new companies joining OpenID Foundation from Decentralized Identity Foundation, working in Europe on ESIF, European SSI initiative, for example. And really the goal is to extend OpenID Connect to enable different emerging use cases, applications in the SSI self-sovereign identity space. And I guess why we want to extend it is simplicity and security of OpenID Connect has been the biggest driver. So there have been different experiments with different ways to transport verifiable credentials, but in authentication, but in the end, Connect has proven is emerging to be the simplest and secure proven solution. So guess don't need to tell this group how amazing OpenID Connect is. And really, as the beauty is, sure, we would have to get more, libraries and code out there, but ideally, if you're already a relying party or OpenID provider that supports OpenID Connect and you want to extend your ecosystem to use self-sovereign identity in some of your use cases, it should be relatively straightforward and simple using the set of specifications we are defining right now. So again, this is not to replace federation or great work happening in FastFed. In certain use cases where big identity providers want to have control over the users, like in enterprise scenarios, definitely that would still be the dominant usage of Connect, but they are definitely emerging use cases where either there are a large number of relying parties trying to exchange user information, or where you want to receive users' information without calling the issuer in mobile driving license specifications use cases, or smart health cards, vaccination credentials use cases, for example, are some of those emerging use cases. And so the overview is really what SSI ecosystem does is it essentially decouples issuance from presentation. So when a user goes to the verifier, the user is not going to be redirected to a third-party OpenID provider to get the claims real time. The user is expected to either have these claims already in their quote-unquote wallet, a place where those claims will be stored, either beforehand or after receiving the request from the verifier. So these parties become separate, the issuer, holder, and verifier, and the flows for issuance and presentations also become separate. So the components are mainly, so on the presentation side, the base protocol is self-issued OP, and some people have confused, but it is not to replace code flow. It's just to say potentially you could do code flow, but just as a basic protocol to exchange metadata, trust relationships would be SIOP. And on top, but SIOP is mainly for authentication in the protocol itself. So if you want to transport verifiable presentations or potentially MDL, or is there any other formats of third-party issuer signed claims, let us know. But that's the extension that OpenID Connect for VPs bring in. And for the issuance, really the base protocol is OpenID Connect. So because there's no limitations of SIOP, SIOP comes in only at the presentation, not the issuance. And this OpenID Connect for credential issuance specification has been adopted by the working group today, would address this issuance side. And so people ask a lot about use cases. So one use case, for example, would be a bank customer wants to sign a car leasing contract, and a leasing provider is required by regulations to provide, to identify the user, AML laws, and the leasing provider uses digital wallet to do that. So leasing wallet sends a customer to the wallet, and let's say, so this is a scenario for all the three specifications, and if the user doesn't have a suitable credential in that wallet, the wallet would offer some options where the user can go get that credential. And if the user agrees to use the wallet to present required identification, user goes where the leasing provider told them to go, so to the bank, and the bank would issue a credential to that wallet. And then user will go back to the leasing provider and present that credential. The leasing company verifies, and the contract proceeds. And I was about to add additional slides, but for example, another large-scale use case we have at Microsoft is NHS, where NHS in the UK manages over 1,200 small clinics, and they're moving doctors constantly all around, and they're trying to prevent fraud of those doctors moving around. So doctors faking their privileges proofs that they can be a doctor. And yes, you could potentially establish a federation between those clinics, but in that case, it was simpler and faster and cheaper to issue verifiable credentials to the doctor so they can use across different clinics. So those kind of use cases are emerging. So status-wise, as mentioned also by Mike, OpenID Connect for credential issuance has been adopted by the working group today. So it's a really good starting point. But yeah, we expect some obvious changes and comments, so feedback we're really welcome. And we are planning to start the call for the implementers draft for SIOP v2 and OIDC for verifiable presentations. I have the list of implementers at the end of the presentation, but the goal is really to give IPR protection to the implementers. And also, as Mike quickly mentioned, ISO Mobile Driving License Working Group is looking at using SIOP as a way to present MDLs online, and they have a really ambitious timeline. So that's been another driver. Because in the MDL ecosystem, the requirement is no talking to the issuer when presenting a mobile driving license. So that has been a driver to use SIOP. And so this is that piece. So very quickly, the specifications have made a lot of progress since I presented last time in the foundation workshop. So I would encourage to take a look if you're interested. And I'll just quickly summarize the additions. So I'm just going to skip the animations. So the biggest improvements have been in discovery and registration. So where the SIOP started, what SIOP inherited from Chapter 7 in OpenID Connect was a really static OpenID OP discovery, where you have just a set of OP metadata tied to custom URI schema OpenID : // And again, the registration, you could only pass registration parameters in the request inside the registration parameters. But what we are observing is obviously there will be a spectrum, but yeah, one spectrum is RP I don't know talking to the SIOPs they're meeting for the first time. So it kind of says, laugh from the first sight. Versus another spectrum being a more regulated set framework / ecosystem in banking, for example, where there's a list of relying parties and potentially a few wallets, listed wallets that accept, where there is an option to pre-agree on the RP registration metadata and for RPs to pre-know SIOPs issuer identifiers. So in that case, their dynamic self-issued OP discovery becomes available. So that's now there's also an option to use universal links and app links to open a wallet, which would enable self-issued OPs being not just the native apps, but also the browser wallets in cloud wallets, potentially PWAs. So that greatly expands the forms of potential SIOPs. And also, yeah, that would enable registration, pre-registration of RPs. And another interesting development has been if you're passing registration information in the request, how to make that information trustworthy, authoritative, how ZDAP has been calling it. And one way is we adopted automatic registration defined in OpenID Federation specification, where you resolve HTTPS URL to obtain an entity statement that is signed and would contain all the registration parameters, or you could use a decentralized identifier as a way to get the key to verify the signature on the request, and you obtain registration. So that kind of makes that registration parameters signed, integrity protected by the key of that issuer. So those mechanisms to establish relationship, trust, exchange of metadata between RP and SIOP has been, I think, the biggest piece, and also the invocation piece. We did make a lot of progress in discussions about cross-device flow as well. And I think I have in the end, but there's interesting development of push. So in OAuth has pushed authorization request, and we are trying to define pushed authorization response, where, because if you're sending a verifiable presentation in the request, that request might be really big, So adapting that idea has been a really interesting thought process. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip these examples. And yeah, so a couple of big updates. OIDC for VP, we're moving to Presentation Exchange version 2. Previous spec was based on V1. So if you're planning to look into it, please look at PEV2. And we still support different credential formats. AnonCred seems to be emerging as, one of the methods people want to use. And one big announcement is an option to embed verifiable presentation in the ID token is not supported anymore. Well, if you have a feedback here, please let us know. We're definitely open to it. But right now, the only option is to use VP token. So this should help with interoperability. Again, skipping the requests. Yeah, and just really quickly about the credential issuance. So it's based on some existing implementations out there. And the biggest benefit is really if you're an OpenID provider who already has information about the users, you can turn it into an issuer of verifiable credentials. So you can, increase the supply of verifiable credentials in the market and, expand the use cases a lot. So this is specification people seems to have been kind of waiting for. So just really briefly, we defined a separate credential endpoint from that would issue verifiable credentials, so not to conflate it with other endpoints like authorization endpoint or token endpoints. definitely allowing different credential formats. But really 2 key aspects has been how do you request, how do you communicate to the OP what type of credential you want to be issued, and how do you bind that issued credential to a key controlled by the user. As I said in the beginning, what's the key change is that issuance is now decoupled from presentation. So for user to be able to prove it actually has been issued to me, the issued credential needs to be tied to certain cryptographic material controlled by the user. So that's what this binding piece talks about. Yes, here's the flow. We don't have much time. And yeah, so just quickly wanted to cover some planned implementation. Definitely Microsoft's implementing Ping Identity, is implementing Sphere and Gimli have built an open source libraries that have been really popular. So that if you're interested, please take a look at that. In Europe, in ASIF, in yes.com, Tello, Spruce are implementing convergence tech work. There's some of those. So we're definitely seeing, looking for more implementation feedback. So yeah. So if FAPI to NSC4P going to the implementer's drafts, there's some still items, so obviously we want to keep working on, but I expect the majority of the work be concentrating on the credential issuance specification. And maybe something interesting to this group is there has been a lot of interest of using WebAuthn or FIDO to strengthen the authentication element of SIOP. So, but we don't have like a concrete consolidated write-up here, so that might be interesting. And I saw a question in the chat. You can run through the slide deck quickly. Yes, it's available in the eKYC use case. Your bank provided ID is the same bank.
So I think Jin was asking, is the bank in this scenario, are they usually the customer's bank, the one they tend to use in day to day?
So yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the easiest would be yes, the bank already has information of the user, so it just turns that information into verifiable credential. But the draft enables different options to get that input information, what to base issue credentials on. So if, let's say, even if there's not an existing relationship between the bank and the user, if user's bringing in, can you real time use these VCs I'm bringing to you and check and approve and do some background checks? So potentially that is also possible. Or bank can redirect user to another IDP. So most of the use cases, yes, user would have relationship, but there are other options too.
We also had a question from Michael Pelage asking for your presentation, Christina, because of course you had to go through it quite quickly. So hopefully you can share that with Mike Les, and Mike Les, hopefully you can confirm that we'll publish the presentations as we usually do.
Yeah, we'll do.
Yep, I did that in the chat. All presentation decks as well as the workshop recording will be published to the OIDF website. There'll be a new page under workshops off the main menu.
Fantastic. And of course, you can find Christina through the SIOP working group if you have further questions, because I know we're at time. So a great thanks to the 30 of you who have hung on with us. We had really great participation throughout this call, so thank you very much. Really appreciate the member conversation and briefing today. And if you have any comments for us on the strategic direction, there's an open call through our blog post asking for member comments on the strategic work of the foundation. And of course, you're warmly encouraged to participate in any of the working groups that you've heard about today. So thank you all for the time. Unless there's any parting comments, Mike or any of the other members of the group, we'll wrap here.
I'm good. Thank you all for participating.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Have a great day and happy holidays.
Happy holidays.